to the Soccer Chaplains United podcast, From the Touchline. And now, here's your host, Rev Brad.
Welcome to a special episode of From the Touchline. Today we mark a significant milestone. A few weeks ago, on March 5th, we released our 300th episode. Today we're at episode 303, and because I'm based in the 303, the primary area code for Denver, Colorado, I thought I'd take just a moment to acknowledge and reflect back a bit on this podcast journey of the last 7 some odd years. Hello everyone, I'm Rev Brad Kenney, founder and executive director of Soccer Chaplains United, the longtime volunteer chaplain to the Colorado Rapids of Major League Soccer. So today I want to embark on a journey through the rich history, I think, of the podcast. And I want to reflect on some memorable moments, some cherished guests, and the unique intersection of faith, family, and football that I've worked to try and define the show, or at least have some guardrail or guideline for the show. So I just want to thank you for listening today, and we're going to go on a little bit of a journey, and I want to go back to the first podcast. The first podcast was February 7th, 2018. When I look back now, the club, the Rapids, they had recently fired head coach Pablo Mastroeni. They had brought in a new head coach. There were a lot of changes going on from the previous season. And as an extension of the work that I was doing, I felt that starting a podcast might help, especially because we were starting to grow chaplaincy into other markets and with other teams, other chaplains. And I think part of my hope in the beginning was that the podcast would reach to some of those others, and that maybe there was a chaplain elsewhere who might benefit from some of the things that I was saying and podcasting on, or it could be something that they could refer into or resource. But here was an early attempt at trying to explain the name and the purpose of the show. Give it a listen. In soccer, or football as the rest of the world calls it, the game takes place on the pitch in between designated lines. The lines that run the length of the field are called the touchline. Essentially, this is a place where you've got to use your hands to get the ball back into play. Only 22 players and a referee play the game between the lines. The rest of us wait and watch from beyond. But there's a lot that happens from the touchline. Coaches shout out instruction, contemplate strategy. Teammates are warming up and shouting out encouragement to their teammates. Other officials watch for infractions and help manage judgments. Trainers and physios wait to treat injuries, and their eyes are focused on making sure that players are playing at peak levels. Family members and fans cheer and chant and sometimes curse. Chaplains, in addition to all of that, well, except for the cursing, we watch and pray, and in our roles as chaplains, there's a load of other things that we do. So whether you're an athlete at the highest level of the game or the lowest, a coach or a staff member, a family member, or a fan, our hope is that From the Touchline will become an encouraging resource for you. It was interesting because in the very beginning, we didn't have any music. We didn't have an opener. We didn't have a closing soundtrack. It was all quite very simple. I think there were a few weeks in, and my buddy and the chaplain of the Portland Timbers, he just recorded a guitar track, and I started using that a few episodes in just to close the pod out. I felt like I needed some sort of like traveling music. You can kind of hear it here as I'm playing it, and I don't know. I loved something about this. It kind of felt like, I remember him asking me like, well, what kind of sound do you want? And I didn't really know, but this kind of seemed to fit. It seemed like, I can kind of see myself walking out to this or closing up the podcast this way. So I still use that track from time to time, but I've had other endings that we've used more recently. And I remember that first year, I kind of podcasted when I felt like it, or when I felt like I had the time, or I felt like I had a good idea. There were 14 different podcasts that year. And as the season wore on and my duties and work with the team began to swell and grow, I kind of put the project of podcasting aside. The writing and recording took a bit of time. I think one of my favorite episodes from that first year, though, was the Fiery or Cool pod. It was episode 6, And I recently, last year, brought it back for a repeat performance. In the episode, though, I comment on EA Sports FIFA 18 character Alex Hunter. And, there's this opportunity that video game fans have to kind of play out the life and career of a professional footballer trying to make their way in the beautiful game. Here, give it a listen.
You were the one who kept telling us everything was going to be okay. He said all the right things, dropped all the right names. Because of you, my career is down the drain. Let alone any chance I had of being called up to the England squad. I made a mistake. Maybe I wanted it too much.
I remember holding my iPhone up to the speaker, the TV speaker, and trying to get as clear an audio recording of that interaction between Alex and his agent. I had a lot of fun with that episode, and I think that as I've gone along in the podcast, I've really tried to incorporate some well-known cultural elements or points where maybe some of the athletes I work with or some of the coaches could have this relatable point. The podcast really began with a vision to explore the spiritual and personal dimensions of soccer as they relate to faith and family and football, as I say. And most of those early episodes, the aim was really to try and keep it short, like a short feature episode, 10, 15 minutes or so. But as it happens with pastors and preachers and chaplains, the podcast eventually kept creeping up and over that average time. And especially when I was interviewing people or doing a season review or a league review with other chaplains, the podcast seemed to go hour and a half. And I know some podcasts, that's their space. They do really well with that. But I think part of a continual hope has been trying to provide people that are listening a sense of reflection, a sense of, like, even in the interviews and the insights, to somehow connect the beautiful game to faith and some of life's broader narratives. And so sometimes that it's difficult because there's this translation work that has to happen. And over the years, at times, I felt this vision blossoming, or some of you might say, well, Rev Brad, it's actually gotten out of control at times, and I wouldn't disagree with you. But it seems like it's become this diverse collection of different episodes. And I think that, just looking 30,000-foot view, I think that maybe each episode has somehow contributed to becoming this rich tapestry, at least I think, for the podcast. Well, just to kind of run down some of the years, 2019 saw 16 episodes, and I forget why I didn't do as many in the beginning of that season, but by the end of the year, I was kind of getting into that weekly rhythm that you need for podcasting. And I remember like someone telling me like, hey, if you want to grow an audience, the best thing to do is be consistent. Be consistent with your release date, your release time, just the frequency of it, and some other things like, the professional sound of the show and maybe some other pieces like that. And, as I think back now, 2019 was a difficult year for me professionally. And I think that in some ways the podcast kind of reemerged as this sort of necessary outlet and extension of my work as a chaplain. It's funny. A lot of times people ask me, hey, Rev, what are you preaching this week? And the assumption is I've got a church and, that's where I'm working, or that's where I am, wherever I'm not with the club. But really the podcast has become and was starting to become a little bit more of that preaching or that message kind of platform. And, 2019 saw, the opener kind of come out in October. We had this new opener with Richard Fleming and Marcelo Balboa, and it's the one we still have today. Let me give it a listen right now.
He's found the space and he's found the back of the net. Just a little off foot, thinking he's going to go far post, not strong enough with his right hand.
Well, that clip, I kind of put it together, and again, my good friend Ben Dudley came in with his guitar, and Richard Fleming, Marcelo are calling some different games there, and that's kind of been the mainstay of getting myself and getting the pod going for the day. And for 2020 is really when the podcast became really consistent. The pandemic and some of the team regulations that were around to try and safeguard the health of the athletes and the essential staff meant that my work as a chaplain had to primarily be virtual from March of that year into later on into fall and beyond. And 2020 was a year when it just seemed this is needed. And we did 53 episodes that year. I did a special episode with my wife. She talked about homeschooling. I remember we had a number of coaches and athletes who, they had children at home and they were wondering, like, how are we going to continue their education if the pandemic and schools are closed down? How do we keep doing this sort of virtual thing? And so I thought it'd be helpful to have an episode where my wife and I could just talk about what homeschooling had looked like for us, and maybe for some of the families that were considering this, hey, maybe here's some tools and resources. And I think, if memory serves me right, this is the only appearance on the podcast of my wife. It's the first and probably the last ever, but here's a short segment. What would you say, what would be your top 3 or so go-to books or resources on homeschooling, or just learning about what it means to educate from home? What would you say those are?
So some of my top 3, I guess, resources would be 101 Top Picks for Homeschool Curriculum by Kathy Duffy. She kind of maps out kind of personality styles in your kids and in yourself, and tries to help you land on a curriculum that guides both you and your kids to something that can benefit for both of you. Because my personality is different than my kids, and so there's when you're picking out curriculum, there's just so much out there for kids that want to do a lot of hands-on stuff versus kids that would rather just work out of a workbook or just do their own selective reading. And this book really did help guide that. Another book that
I remember sitting across the dining room table from her, recording that with 2 microphones, and at first she was kind of like, really? It's not really her thing, but I was like, no, really, this is a big question right now. It would be helpful to hear some things, and so that was an interesting pod. But again, just trying to address some of the things that were going on in 2020, and I think the homeschooling piece was part of it. And for a lot of years, after I left full-time church work and church staff, I had an office in my home. And so from May 2015 until May 2022, I was literally working downstairs in the basement whenever I was home. It meant that I was often right across from my wife and my younger ones as they were doing homeschooling. And so I have so many stories, and they have a lot more stories, of me telling the family, hey, don't stomp around upstairs, or, hey, I'm recording a podcast. Don't flush the toilets for the next 15 minutes because, the water would be running down through the walls, or don't take a shower, or, hey, I've got to record, keep the house quiet. And there were so many times that I was trying to do this that my kids really, it just became a thing, My kids even made this short video chronicling my attempts to keep a quiet house at the time. Then, with this podcast, we're not really doing video, but there's a video out there, I'll tell you that. And someday it will show. But here's a little audio clip from that video, which I think just kind of captures a bit of what was going on in the house during those years.
Hello, welcome to the Brad Podcast, episode 15. Quiet! Sorry about that. Today we're talking about love and compassion. So on the Brad Podcast, this is one of our newest things of SoccrChapUtd United and Rapid stuff, but we just want to...
Well, certainly that made for fun days and fun times, at least on someone's side of it. I'm not sure. Maybe the kids were like, Dad, you're yelling at us too much. But it was just interesting because I ended up being the podcaster and the principal at times. So sometimes I had to intervene in disciplinary issues and other things to keep schooling on track and to help my wife. But, I was usually home 2 to 3 days a week. And the rest of the time I'd, be at the stadium or meeting someone at a coffee shop. But we all have plenty of memories of the podcast being part of the house, part of the home, and I think that's why my kids call it the Brad Podcast. And maybe someday I'll show that epic video that we laugh about. Well, moving on, we've got a lot of ground to cover. One of the things that as the podcast grew more and more and started to take shape was, we do these interviews, and sometimes the interviews would go into this deep place, and so I didn't want us, to just be in this deep part of someone's story without a way to kind of lighten the load or lighten the story and kind of emerge from the proverbial a bathtub depth of someone's story. And so in order to kind of get, someone that I was interviewing laughing or get us going, or even just to kind of say, here's this person, let's get to know them a little bit better, I came up with this little game called Crosses with Rev. So Crosses with Rev is one of the segments that I've really enjoyed putting together. It's me doing a little bit of research on someone. It's figuring out, what schools did they go to, or what are their likes and dislikes, and some of them soccer related, some of them not. But it's this 1 minute little segment with a little bit of sound effects in there, and they're answering these rapid fire questions. And the whole point is answer as many questions as you can, and just win a prize kind of thing. Although I don't think I've ever given out a prize, but there was all these sort of questions about soccer, about football, about life and faith, and it's an either or fill in the blank kind of thing, and it was just kind of fun. Amongst the other soccer chaplains who have been guests on the show, there's a little bit of competition, and I think there's some disgruntledness as well. I think sometimes guys don't believe I'm really asking the questions as quickly as I should or could, and I blame that a little bit on Zoom or however we're doing the interview, but it's all good fun. And currently, good friend Ben Dudley, our former Portland Timbers chaplain, still top of the leaderboard. He came in with 25 points a couple years ago, and there's just a few guys that are behind him, and it's almost like I'm always tempted, like, oh, should we just do a Crosses with Rev competition or something? But I think sometimes the most fun I've had is when people flip it on me and they come up with questions and they're like, hey, Rev, let's go. Like, it's going to be Crosses with me. Let me see if you can answer my questions. And I think some of them, one or two of them, have gone slow on purpose. But if you've never heard of Crosses with Rev, here was a fun one that I did just to give you a taste. This is Steve Guppy, and he was one of the early ones that we did. And just listen to the sound clip for a minute.
Here we go. Left or right-footed?
Left.
Favorite football club is?
Leicester City.
Martin O'Neill or Gary Smith?
Oh, pass.
Golf or tennis?
Tennis.
Fly rod or spinner?
Spinner.
Plane or train?
Train.
Atlanta United FC or Cincinnati FC?
Pass.
Casey or Cummings?
Pass.
Favorite post-game meal is?
Say that again.
Favorite post-game meal?
Pasta.
Sweet or savory?
Sweet.
Foxes or Wanderers?
Wanderers.
4-4-2 or 4-5-1?
4-4-2.
MLS Cup or Football League Cup?
Football League Cup.
Old Wembley or New Wembley?
Old Wembley.
All right, that's it.
Oh, I should have gone for MLS Cup there, really. That was a bit selfish of me. But there you go.
Well, and looking back over the past 7 years, I've really been privileged to host a variety of guests, and they've all shared their unique perspectives, that come in at the intersection of soccer and spirituality, and whether they're professional players or coaches, fellow chaplains. And I think each conversation really is enriching for an understanding of how faith informs and transforms the beautiful game. And just some of the guests that have graced the show, good friend Greg Dalby, currently head coach at Air Force Academy. Wells Thompson, former MLS Cup winner. He's now on the Soccer Chaplains United board. Steve Guppy, as I mentioned, former England international winger for Leicester City, coached at Nashville SC. Jared Watts, captain of the U.S. at the 2009 U17 World Cup. He was a member of the Colorado Rapids for a number of years. John Hollinger, a goalkeeper who I got to know. He was playing overseas, and he had started this podcast, A Footballer's Faith, and so having him on as a guest. Brian Schultz, another good friend of mine, former longtime head coach at Valor Christian High School. And there's been many others, including Adam Smith, Rod Underwood, Dylan Powers, and of course several appearances from Soccer Chaplains United chaplains. And all very interesting guests to have. And I think, some of my favorites have been the ones where we get to hear the personal stories from the athletes and coaches themselves. Maybe it was a moment of triumph or a moment of despair. And I love, too, when the chaplains have been able to share, they're all doing great work. And we're not really out there sharing and putting our stories out into the public foray and saying like, hey, look at us, see what we've done. But there's been some amazing stories that our chaplains have shared in those interview times, whether it's taking electrolyte pops out during a hot, humid summer training day. There's just been those moments when you get to hear some of the work of the chaplain, some of the stories of the athletes and coaches. And I think, too, one of the things I've learned over that time is that I used to we do a long interview and call it good. But I've started breaking up those interviews into smaller segments because, one, I think it's easier for us to digest things in a smaller amount of time. And, I'm just curious if listeners have a favorite themselves. And, maybe if you're new to the podcast, you just go back, search some of these interviews and some of these stories. And there are really some great nuggets, some great treasures in those that have been willing to share their stories with us. And I think that, besides those guests, I think some of my other favorites have tended to be the mini series or the subsets of the podcast. There's just these little creative ventures and maybe there's something that kind of we encounter. I'll tell you, my absolute favorite has been the Lesson from Lasso series. And we did it over a span of 4 seasons. It was great. I really had a fun time putting that opener together. And in the Lessons from Lasso series, if you haven't seen the show, it's inspired by Apple TV's Ted Lasso. But really the goal was kind of to give a chaplain's perspective, looking at the leadership moments in the show or some of the empathy and resilience that was portrayed by different characters in the Ted Lasso show. I wanted to relate those to real life sort of chaplain moments and scenarios on and off the pitch and kind of give like, hey, this is what this really looks like in a football club. And yeah, a lot of what you see in that show is true. And so I wanted to kind of affirm those things and say like, in my experience, here's where the chaplain has stepped in and served, or this is similar, or hey, here's a lesson out of this maybe that you can take with you and carry, whether you're in the beautiful game or not, whether you're in business. Here's some things that you can learn from this. Now, what I find is interesting is that throughout the series of the podcast, one episode in particular has kind of risen to the top. It was our Lesson from Lasso's Army Men to Keep You Safe. It's actually the second most viewed page on our website. So I don't know what that means. Next to our homepage, which usually your front page gets the most views, this Lesson from Lasso's Army Men to Keep You Safe is the second most viewed page. And now, I don't know if it's the Chinese or the Russian crawlers and bots that maybe they picked up on the title, or actually it's getting a lot of massive downloads and listens, but that show, that page itself has had over 1,500 views, if I read the Google Analytics report correctly. And I just think it's super interesting that particular podcast, for whatever reason, has just gotten a lot of attention, a lot more attention than some of the other things on our website. Also, too, there's 2 other Lessons from Lasso podcasts that are in the top 25 for our website page numbers. One of the episodes, Being Accountable Matters, and the other one, The Game Before the Dame, coming in at number 5 and number 12, respectively. And I think that's pretty cool because, like I said, I really enjoyed putting the podcast series together. I even wrote to Apple trying to get permission to say, hey, can I use some of the Ted Lasso artwork for this? I'm just going to put it up on a few episodes and for the show series. And got an email back, said, sure, yeah, you're fine. Go ahead and use that. No problem. So I know I'm big time. No, not really, but it's been fun to try and be creative around these kinds of things. What I also love too is the lessons from Lasso were shorter 7 to 10 minute pieces. So I think sometimes, like even today, this podcast is going well over our average time or the time that we hope for. But those lessons from Lassos were hitting in at 7, 8, 10 minutes. And if you fast forward past the minute-long intro, they were even shorter. And they still took time to think through, write out, and put together. But I think that's probably been, for me, one of the highlights of the last 300 episodes is those lessons from lassos. We did about 65 of them in all, and all of them coming from just season 1. I thought that maybe it would go quicker, or I'd get into seasons 2, 3, and beyond. But it felt like I really had to, as I'd watch a show, I'd watch to enjoy, and then maybe I'd watch again and kind of go, okay, let me talk on that. Let me write on that. And so it took me a long time, 65 episodes. That's like a full year of podcasting just to get through season 1 of the show. And so, it kind of came to a point last year in 2024 where I felt like, the lessons from lassos kind of run its course. I've covered most of the, larger topics that could be covered. Maybe there's a few here and there. And there's a few things I think in season 2 where I saw in the Higgins character, I was like, oh yeah, I could write more on that. But I really felt like the lessons from Lasso had kind of run its course. The show had ended. Of course, it might be coming back, so who knows? Maybe these things revive, but I just had a lot of fun doing that. Another favorite series of mine was the Cambridge Rules of Football series. Now, this was shorter, 11 episodes, but I remember coming across this memorial during my visit to Cambridge in the summer of 2022. I found this historical sort of monument statue, and it was interesting to me to kind of explore some of soccer's history and kind of relay that into sort of a chaplaincy or faith perspective. And what's interesting too is that a couple of those podcasts also are ranking in the top 25 for our website hits. Rules number 1 and 8 come in. Rule number 1 I think ranks 21 on our page website hits, and Rule 8 ranks 15. So, all in all, there's in between those lessons from Lasso and the Rules of Football from Cambridge, there's these 5 podcast episodes that are up in the top 25, and I love that. I think that's something that's pretty cool, pretty unique. Well, something that I've noticed and I've often wondered back, and I welcome feedback on, is that podcasting is seeming to have a day. Some of you might know that I went in my undergraduate, I finished at Moody Bible Institute with a communications degree. And so when I first went to Moody, I went to be a radio communications major. I was going to get into broadcasting. And I think it was a couple years in, and I had been working for a radio station, and I thought, you know what, radio may not survive these next few years. Now, this was back in the mid 90s, and I think really the advent of the internet and the applications of the internet have saved radio broadcasting, those kinds of things. But podcasting is kind of having this day right now. And I think for me, part of the commitment towards the work and the production that has to go in and week out really grew out of COVID. And I think that as the global pandemic kind of shut things down and kind of gripped the world in this really unique way, podcasting became the thing. Now, since then, I've seen a number of colleagues who maybe started podcasting in 2020. They've dropped off, or they've stopped in the last few years. And I've wondered, is it time? Like maybe From the Touchline, this as a podcast, maybe we've run our course as well. What are we doing? And is this the best use of time? Are people even listening? Because I think sometimes you can podcast and you can see, okay, there's downloads, there's listens. You can get those analytics. But if you're not hearing from people, and I don't know, maybe I'm expecting a phone call from someone other than mom and dad to go, hey, I really enjoyed your show today. But you don't hear those things often. At least I don't. And I've not made a big thing to try to broadcast and publicize and produce and get all the listens and things that I know other podcasts do, and trying to monetize things. I think more of this has been like, how do I share my heart? And I think that during 2020 and 2021, there were so many unprecedented challenges that COVID brought into the world, and especially hitting the soccer community, the soccer industry, bringing really the game to a standstill in many ways. And a lot of what emerged was very different. We're working remote, we're wearing masks. We have this thing called Zoom meetings, and there's bombers or infiltrators into these Zoom meetings, and so many more things. And I think that during those years, the microphone became, for me as a chaplain, and even for other chaplains with SoccrChapUtd United, the microphone became an important tool. Because as we weren't around the teams physically and present and face-to-face, we needed to find ways to still provide pastoral care, comfort, guidance to those who were facing these difficult things in soccer. And so the podcast really tried to become, in those years especially, a resource that offered hope, encouragement, and a sense of community. I think sometimes we don't think about what happens to athletes and others who leave the game or go to distant parts of the world to continue pursuing their dreams, or they're just trying to play out the beautiful game. And I think that some of the issues that came to light in the COVID years, like mental health, isolation, maintaining and growing one's spiritual health and faith, or finding common ground and unity in times of uncertainty, I mean, these issues are still around today. I know some things have gotten a little bit more attention, but maybe now that the crisis has passed, these issues don't seem as prominent or as pronounced as they were during COVID. And, I'm not really a big fan of recycling content, but I do think that some of the episodes and some of the podcasts produced during that time really can help continue encouraging a depth for one's resilience to kind of say, like, hey, there's a spirituality, there's a faith component that needs to be cultivated here. And I think, too, it can demonstrate some of the unifying power that faith and sport and faith and soccer bring. So, along those lines, though, as I'm talking, I realize sometimes I've been critical of myself. Sometimes I've been critical of where the podcast is actually landing, if I'm honest. And I just go, mate, is this really, am I just weird? I think that's sometimes what I say to myself. What comes to mind almost immediately is the Advent antiphons. For example, I produced these in late 2023 during the season of Advent. So in that time, November to December, I had done a series, I think 10 or 11 of these Advent antiphons, and had music and readings. And, I think there's a part of me that goes, is this really connected to soccer, or is it just me? I just want to do something. I just want to say something. But, maybe some of these things have been a stretch. Maybe some of you would be like, yeah, Rev Brad, that was a stretch. And I think, too, I tend to be ultra critical of myself. But sometimes I do feel like I see things, feel things, understand, hear things that I feel like relate to football. And maybe it's too much of my personality going into the pod, but I feel like I'm making these connections and I want others to see it, feel it, understand, experience it too. No matter how odd it might be or how crazy the idea is. And so, maybe I could be accused of doing a podcast filler, but I think I'm really trying to connect these other pieces and parts of life historically, traditionally, faith-wise into football. And I think, too, along the way, one of the things someone could blame me for is wanting to display different people's talents, especially out of our chaplain group. As I've gotten to know them, as I work and serve alongside of them, I've gotten to know that several of them, not including me, have great musical talents. And I've often thought, you know what, we should have something like The Voice or Chaplain's Got Talent kind of competition amongst our chaplain group, because several of them are really musically gifted. And I've wanted to feature and showcase that. So, some of the special episodes include these musical performances by our chaplains, and I think they add this rich cultural layer to what we're doing. And I know that even some of the chaplains have utilized this from time to time. I know that some of the chaplains have gotten together with athletes or coaches or staff members and done guitar lessons. This was something that happened during COVID. And there was another moment during the Christmas season. Billy Cerveny, who was serving Nashville SC, is now in Jacksonville, and Ben Dudley, they play guitar really well and sing really well. And again, I don't know. Someone could say, you're just trying to fill podcast space and content. But I think, too, I've wanted, in different moments, I've wanted to give a gift. Maybe it's for that footballer, it's for that coach who's a million miles away from home. And, they're in a foreign country. They're hearing a foreign language all the time. And maybe just hearing a Christmas carol or a song, something might lift them in a particular moment when they're discouraged, when they feel isolated. There was one such moment came at the end of 2020, and it was this original song that was kind of born out of what people were experiencing in the pandemic. And as Ben Dudley, you'll hear him here in a second, as he and I were talking, we're like, people are kind of like into this mode now, like, it's cool, I'm all right. And it was this deflection, like we weren't really talking about the things that were really going on. And so, I just remember as Ben and I were kind of nearing the end of that year, and this song had kind of born out of some conversations, and he wrote it, and I'm like, dude, let's hear it. Let's hear it. Can we put this out there? And Ben worked to kind of work on the vocals and the guitar and everything else. But it just seemed like, yeah, this is the kind of thing that we might need an athlete or a coach or someone who's really dealing with stuff. We might need them to hear this.
Like what I see, don't want to believe the lies even I'm telling me, don't want to drown in regret or give in to despair, don't want to yield to my demons, oh this is my prayer, don't want to go through this life denying the pain, viewing heartache and heartbreak is always in vain. Don't want to shut the world out, don't want to close myself in, don't want to feel like a hostage in my own skin, don't want to look in the mirror and not like what I see, don't want to believe the lies I'm telling me, don't want to drown in regret or give in to despair, don't want to yield to my demons, oh this is my prayer.
Now, I know I sound all over the place with this, and we've gone long today, but I just feel these musical moments aren't just a testament to the talents that we have amongst our core of chaplains, but they're part of the place where we want to serve. I'll never forget one of our chaplains telling me after one of our retreats that they had found the music again. Ministry life had left him severely discouraged. He kind of put the guitar aside, and it was too painful to pick up the reminders. And during that retreat time, several of us were kind of playing guitars and singing, and I think there was something sparked in him and something that kind of brought back to life a significant part of his life that had been there for a while. And so in some ways, it feels really good to know that Soccer Chaplains United and our work and these moments sometimes that come out through the podcast isn't just about serving soccer externally, but there's a work going on inside of our group amongst our chaplains, and it feels good to highlight those things, and a lot of that coming through the podcasting itself. Well, here we are, episode 303 in the 303 on 3/26/25. I think reaching that 300 episode milestone shouldn't just be a celebration of the past, but maybe there's a little bit of a stepping stone into the future. Of course, today, you've just heard it. We've debuted a new opener for the podcast. There's some new artwork. And I think even doing this bit of a review has refreshed me and refreshed some of the ideas and hopes for the podcast for the future. And I know all these things have to be held appropriately. I firmly believe that the best work of the chaplain is done one-to-one, face-to-face. And I know too, that isn't always possible. And there may be future moments like a COVID-19 that disrupt the options and opportunities. But will something like this podcast continue to grow? Are there other metrics that maybe I ought to be paying attention to? Well, I think time will tell. And I guess I'm just going to have to depend on God to say, hey, yeah, keep going, or stop it, or pause it, or change up the frequency or something else. And I just think, I don't know what the future holds, but it's kind of been cool to kind of go back and do this review and look back over the past. So friends, thanks again. In commemorating this time, this 300 and now 303rd episode, I just want to say thank you. And I want to extend a heartfelt sense of gratitude, whether you've been a listener, whether you've been a guest, to anyone, to everyone who might feel like somehow they're part of the Soccer Chaplains United family. I've gotten messages sometimes from a family member who's like, hey, I kind of put your podcast into my young athlete's life, as something to listen to. And it's totally not part of the intended audience, but it's really cool to kind of get those words that maybe someone in a distant part of the country or a distant part of the globe is listening and deriving some hope and encouragement out of this. And, my hope is that every time I close out with the line, this is Rev Brad coming to you from the touchline, that someone out there, an athlete, a coach, a staff member, someone connected to the beautiful game would just feel the love, the care, and support of a dear friend who's really more than a fan of the game. And no matter where you are in life or in the beautiful game, maybe the talk of the pod for the day, maybe it feels to you like, oh yeah, I'm getting some good life coaching or faith coaching out of this moment. Well, I just hope that and pray that instruction, that moment for you is for your good and really for God's glory. It might feel cheesy to say, I hope these times feel more to you than a podcast, but more like a trusted conversation with me, the chaplain, the Rev, however you might call me, with me as your friend. Well, I look forward, friends, to the next chapter in your journey and mine as we continue to live out and explore the rich interplay of faith, family, and football. Thanks for being part of the story thus far. And as we go out today, one last play as we retire these last lines. Thanks for listening. This has been Rev Brad coming to you from the touchline.